I want to use the personal portion of this supervision the way you said I could. I know the form is mostly for caseload review. I'm not here for caseload. I want to put something on the record while I can still say it the way I remember it, because in a week or two, I think I will be saying it differently, and I would prefer the earlier version to exist somewhere. I've been the day interpreter on the women's and children's floor for 19 months. Dari and Pashto primarily, with Dutch and a little Urdu when the rota is short. I cover the antenatal clinic on the 3rd floor, the pediatric ward on the 4th, the bereavement room on the 2nd, the psychiatric admissions room behind the lift on the ground floor, and whatever the oncology coordinator asks me to sit in on when families need to give consent for something their child cannot pronounce. I do on average 11 encounters a day. I have done, by my own count, somewhere in the region of 2,400 encounters in this hospital. I am telling you that number because I want you to understand that what I am about to describe is not a single strange afternoon. It is a pattern I have only just become able to look at directly, and the looking, I think, is itself the problem. I will start with the training, because the training is where the procedure that frightens me was set. When I came in, the senior interpreter, Mrs. Khalili, took me through what she called the courtesies and what the hospital calls professional standards for community interpreters. There were 6 of them, she stressed. I have them on a laminated card in my badge pouch. I want to read them out because I want you to hear them in the order she gave them, not in the order the policy document lists them. 1. The interpreter speaks in the first person, in the voice of the speaker, and does not editorialize. If the patient says, "I am afraid," you say, "I am afraid." If the doctor says, "We will keep your daughter overnight," you say, "We will keep your daughter overnight." You do not say the doctor says, you become the mouth. 2. The interpreter does not add and does not subtract. If a sentence is unintelligible, you say the patient said a phrase I cannot render. Please ask again. You do not guess. You do not soften. You do not protect the doctor from the family, or the family from the doctor. 3. The interpreter does not introduce themselves to the patient beyond their first name and the word interpreter. You do not say where you are from. You do not say what languages you speak in your kitchen. You do not say what you think of the diagnosis. You give them your first name, and you give them the role. 4. The interpreter sits at the 3rd corner of the triangle. The doctor at one corner, the patient at one corner, you at the 3rd corner, and you face neither of them directly. You face the empty 4th corner. This is the corner you are speaking into. This is so the patient and the doctor speak to each other and not to you. Mrs. Khalili told me this twice. She said, "The room has 4 corners, and you are looking at the one that nobody is sitting in." 5. The interpreter does not retain the content of the encounter. You walk out, and you close the file, and you do not carry the patient's words home with you. She said it as a wellness rule, the way they tell nurses to leave the ward at the ward. I understood it as a wellness rule. I will tell you in a moment why I think it was not a wellness rule. 6. The interpreter does not initiate. You do not begin speaking until a speaker has spoken. You do not finish a thought a speaker has paused inside. You do not anticipate. If a doctor is searching for a word, you wait. If a patient is silent, you are silent. Your voice is the voice of the speaker. If there is no speaker, there is no voice. 6 rules. I learned them in the first afternoon. I have followed all 6 for 19 months. I want to say plainly, I am good at this job. I am told I am good at this job. The doctors request me by name, and the mothers ask when I am next on the rota. Children calm down when I speak to them. There is a small specific kind of pride a person feels when they are useful in a hospital, and I have felt it. I want that on the record too, because I do not want what I am about to say to sound like the account of someone who was already unwell. The phrase first happened in March. I will give the date because the date is on the encounter form. The 14th of March, a woman from Kunduz province, 32 weeks pregnant, arrived through the refugee health pathway with a previous fetal loss at 36 weeks in a different jurisdiction and severe anxiety about the present pregnancy. The consult was with the high-risk midwife and the social worker. I was the interpreter. The encounter ran 90 minutes. The mother was articulate, frightened, deeply tired, and what she wanted very clearly was to be told the baby would not die. The midwife, very correctly, was not able to tell her that. The social worker was not able to tell her that. I was not able to tell her that because I am the mouth and I had no such sentence to render. About 40 minutes into the encounter, between two questions from the social worker, the mother said something to me directly. She turned in the chair toward me, breaking the triangle. I should have looked at the empty corner. I did not, because the patient was turning toward me, and the courtesy of human eye contact is a small thing I have never been able to switch off entirely. She said, "Indari, bogo kemara meshnawad." Tell him that he hears me. That was the sentence. Bogo kemara meshnawad. It was not a sentence directed to the social worker or the midwife. The grammar was wrong for that. The him in the sentence is a third party not in the room. I sat with it for perhaps 1 second. Mrs. Khalili's second rule says, I do not subtract. I said it in Dutch. I said, she says, tell him that he hears me. The midwife looked up kindly and asked who the him was. I asked. The mother shook her head and said it was nothing. She was tired. She had not meant to say it aloud. The midwife noted in the chart that the patient had referenced an absent third party and might benefit from a psychiatric liaison referral. The midwife is thoughtful, and that was a thoughtful note. We continued. The encounter resolved in the mother accepting a closer monitoring schedule. She delivered safely in May. The baby is alive. I checked. I want to be precise about what I felt when she said the sentence, because what I felt is the thing I am trying to describe. I did not feel frightened. I felt the kind of warm, focused attention you feel when someone in your own language addresses you directly in a room where everyone has been speaking around you. I felt visible. I had been the mouth for 40 minutes, and for 1 second I had been a person, and a frightened pregnant woman had asked me to tell someone something. The someone was unspecified. I rendered the sentence and we moved on. That should have been the end of it. The second time was 9 days later. A 4-year-old girl in for a bone scan suspected Langerhans, and the parents were ethnically Pashtun, but the mother spoke Dari fluently and preferred to consult in Dari because the technical vocabulary in Pashto was harder for her. I was interpreting for the radiology consent, which is a short scripted consult, perhaps 15 minutes. The radiographer was explaining the cannulation. The child was on her mother's lap, very still. The way frightened children become very still rather than crying. I was at the third corner. I was looking at the empty fourth corner. The mother was looking at the radiographer. The radiographer was looking at the consent form. The child, who had not spoken for the entire consult, said into the front of her mother's cardigan, very quietly, in Dari, Bogo Kemara Meshnawad. Tell him that he hears me. The mother looked down at the top of her daughter's head and said, in Dari, you don't speak Dari, Janam. Where did you hear that? The child did not answer. The mother apologized to me, which was unnecessary, and said the girl picked up phrases. I rendered the sentence to the radiographer because Rule 2 says I do not subtract. The radiographer wrote, Child appears to have spoken in Dari, mother surprised, and asked very gently whether the family had Dari-speaking neighbors. They did. The consent was signed. The scan was completed. The child has been in remission for 14 months. I checked. I want to be clear that on the 23rd of March, I did not connect the two events. The first sentence was a frightened pregnant woman addressing an absent third party. The second sentence was a 4-year-old repeating a phrase she had heard somewhere. These do not pattern in the mind of someone who has been trained to walk out of the room and close the file. Mrs. Khalili's 5th rule. I closed the file. I walked out. I went home and made Kabili pulao for my flatmate and did not think about it again for, by my count, 11 weeks. The third occurrence was on the 7th of June. I have the date because the encounter form is in my badge pouch and I have been carrying it for reasons I will come to. A 15-year-old girl, second generation, Belgian-born, Pashtun on the father's side, admitted to the adolescent psychiatric assessment room behind the lift on the ground floor following a non-fatal overdose at home. The reason I was called rather than a Pashto interpreter was that the girl's preferred language for difficult conversations, as according to her older brother who had brought her in, was Dari, which had been the language of the household when her late grandmother lived with them. The grandmother had died 11 months earlier. The consult was with the on-call adolescent psychiatrist and a social worker from the youth team. The girl was lucid, post-medical, exhausted, and very quiet. The consult ran 45 minutes. About 30 minutes in, the psychiatrist asked the girl, in Dutch, whether she could describe what she had been thinking about in the hour before she took the tablets. I rendered the question into Dari. The girl looked at me, broke the triangle, the way the pregnant woman had, and said, Bogo Kemara Meshnawad. I want to tell you what I did, because what I did is what I am here for. I rendered the sentence. I said in Dutch, she says, I tell him that he hears me. The psychiatrist asked who him referred to. I asked. The girl said without looking up, the doctor. The psychiatrist took this as the girl externalizing a relational fear about being heard by clinicians, which is a reasonable clinical interpretation, and adjusted the consult accordingly. The encounter ended with the girl agreeing to an inpatient stay, which she completed, and from which she was discharged in good condition. When I left that room and walked across the lobby to clock the encounter into the system, I noticed 2 things. The first was that my hand was shaking slightly. The second was that I could not remember whether I had rendered the sentence or only thought it. I had to check the recording. We record all psychiatric consults with consent. And the sentence is on the recording in my voice in Dutch, exactly as I described it. So, I had said it. The shake was not from the saying. The shake was from a smaller thing. The shake was that for the first time, I had recognized the sentence on its way out of the patient's mouth, before she had finished the word mesh nawad. The recognition had arrived a syllable early. I want to mark this as the first time my body acknowledged the pattern. My conscious mind did not acknowledge it for another 7 weeks. The fourth occurrence was on the 29th of July. I was on the antenatal suite. A different patient, no relation to the first, prima gravida, 26 years old, husband present, normal labor, second stage, no complications, and the kind of birth where the room is loud and competent, and the interpreter mostly conveys the midwife's instructions in short bursts. Push now, breathe, slow, 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 good. The mother was managing the pain extremely well. Between contractions in the lull she said, in Dari, addressed to no one, Bogo Kimara Meshnawad. The midwife, who has worked with me for a year, glanced at me. I rendered it. The midwife said very kindly into the room, "We hear you, love. We are right here." The baby was born 9 minutes later. Healthy. The mother went home 2 days later. Healthy. I checked. I will tell you what I noticed in that room. I noticed that the midwife had stopped what she was doing and looked at me, not at the patient, when I rendered the sentence. I noticed that the midwife had looked at me the way people look at the source of a sound. I noticed that the rendering felt in my mouth as though I had said it before, not as though I had heard it before, as though I had said it before. The Dutch words came out in the same order as on the 7th of June, the same intonation, the same pause before me. I came out of the suite and went to the staff toilet and stood in front of the mirror for what was probably 4 minutes, looking at my face. This is, I think, the moment where a reasonable person stops. I did not stop. I went to my next consult, which was a routine post-natal check on the ward, and I was professional, and the encounter resolved, and I went home. The 5th occurrence was the one I will not be able to unsay once I say it, so I want to set it up properly. On the 14th of September 4 weeks ago, I was called to the pediatric oncology unit to interpret a consent for a bone marrow transplant for a 7-year-old boy with refractory acute lymphoblastic leukemia. His parents are Hazara from Bamyan. They speak Dari at home. The consent encounter was scheduled for 45 minutes and was led by Dr. V, who is the consultant the parents had been with for 14 months and trusted completely. I had interpreted 6 previous encounters in this family's care, including the original diagnosis, including the first relapse. I knew the family. I knew the boy's name without looking at the file. I knew his older sister's name. I knew that his mother brought Bolani to the ward on Wednesdays. I am telling you this because Rule 5 says I do not retain, and over 14 months with this family I had retained. The encounter began at 14:12. Dr. V explained in Dutch the procedure, the risks, the likelihood of remission, the likelihood of complications, the donor situation. I rendered all of this in Dari. The parents asked the questions parents ask. Dr. V answered them. The boy was in the room, on his mother's lap, in pajamas with foxes on them, very quiet, the same stillness as the 4-year-old in March. At 14:38, Dr. V asked whether the parents wished to proceed. The mother said, "In Dari, Bogo Kemara Meshnawad." I rendered it. I said in Dutch, she says, "Tell him that he hears me." Dr. V, who is not theatrical, paused for approximately 3 seconds. Dr. V then said, also in Dutch, "We hear you, and we will proceed." I rendered this in Dari. The mother nodded. The father signed the consent. The encounter ended at 14:41. I walked out of the room. I went down the back stairs. I sat on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors for, I think, 20 minutes. I will tell you what I sat there with. I sat there with the recognition that Dr. V had answered, "We hear you," before I had finished rendering. That she had begun the sentence on the word Meshnawad, which is the last word of the Dari phrase. That she had not waited. That she had not asked who him was. That she had not behaved like a doctor, encountering an unusual sentence from a frightened mother. She had behaved like a doctor, receiving an expected sentence at an expected moment in an expected sequence. I sat there with the recognition that the consent had been signed at the moment the phrase had been spoken, and that this was true of every previous occurrence I could remember. The pregnant mother in March accepted closer monitoring at the moment of the phrase. The 4-year-old's parents signed the radiology consent at the moment of the phrase. The 15-year-old agreed to inpatient psychiatric admission at the moment of the phrase. The laboring mother delivered 9 minutes after the phrase. Every clinical decision in this hospital, in fact, every difficult clinical decision since March, that I had interpreted had been preceded by the phrase, by less than a minute. I want to say plainly, this is not how Dari works. Bogo Kemara Meshnawad is a perfectly ordinary clause in Dari. It is something you might say. It is not a culturally specific phrase. It is not a religious phrase. It is not a phrase that is statistically more likely to be spoken by Afghan patients than any other Dari speaker. It is a 5-word sentence that means, tell him that he hears me, and the him is grammatically a third party who is not in the room. I sat on the landing, and I thought, for the first time, about the him. I want to tell you what I did next, because what I did next is the procedure I have been following since, and I want you to evaluate the procedure. I went to my desk. I opened the encounter log, which is the system the interpreter office uses to log start times, durations, languages, and short anonymized notes. I searched the notes field for the Dutch rendering. Tell him that he hears me. The search returned 6 entries from the past 7 months. 2 of them I did not remember. I will say that again, because I want it on the record. 2 of the 6 entries with the phrase, tell him that he hears me in the notes field, were entered by me under my login with my initials on dates I worked and encounters I attended that I did not remember. The first was the 3rd of May on the bereavement floor, a family receiving the body of their grandfather. I had no recollection of being on the bereavement floor on the 3rd of May. I checked the rota. I had been on the bereavement floor on the 3rd of May. I had logged the encounter as completed in 58 minutes and added the phrase to the notes field. The second was the 18th of June in the Pediatric High Dependency Unit. Again, I had no recollection. Again, I had been there. Again, I had logged it. I went home. I did not sleep that night. And I want to be clear that I did not sleep, not because I was frightened, but because I was working. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote down, from memory, every Dari encounter I had had since the 1st of January, by date, by floor, by patient initials where I could remember them. I had 41 of them in my own handwriting. The log had 47. I was missing 6. In the morning, I went back to the office and I pulled the audio recordings for the 6 missing encounters. We have audio for consult room encounters with consent. 4 of the 6 had audio. I listened to all 4. In all 4, my voice rendered, in Dutch, she says, tell him that he hears me. And in all 4, the clinician responded, we hear you, and we will proceed. In all 4, the decision being made was a decision the family would, on any reasonable clinical reading, you have made anyway. A withdrawal of futile care, a consent for a high-risk surgery on a baby, a transfer to palliative pediatrics, a decision about a feeding tube. The phrase appeared in my voice in Dutch within 90 seconds of each decision. I want to be careful here. I want to be careful because I have rehearsed this part and I have not yet said it aloud to anyone. I am going to say it once. The phrase was being spoken in the room by the patient. I was rendering it. The clinician was answering it. The decision was being made. This was the structure of every difficult consult I had interpreted since the 14th of March. The phrase was the procedure. The phrase was the moment the consult closed. The phrase was not an aberration in the consult. The phrase was what the consult was for. The interpreter, I, was the person whose mouth the phrase had to pass through in order for the decision to be valid. And I do not know which of us was saying it first. I want to read you the 6th rule again. The interpreter does not initiate. The interpreter does not begin speaking until a speaker has spoken. I want to ask you on this recording, on the personal section of this supervision, whether you can be certain, whether anyone in this hospital can be certain, that in any of those 6 encounters, the Dari sentence preceded the Dutch sentence in real time. I cannot be certain. On the recording from the 7th of June, the adolescent psychiatric admission, the patient's sentence, and my rendering overlap by approximately 0.3 of a second. I have the file. I have listened to it 11 times. The sentences begin at the same moment. This is the contradiction I cannot resolve. If I am rendering, I am following. If I am leading, I am not an interpreter. There is no third option that respects Rule 6. I will tell you what I think has happened. I will tell you so that what I think is on the record, because I am aware that within some period of weeks, I am going to stop thinking it, and the version of me who has stopped thinking it will not be able to put it back. I think that something has been using the third corner of the triangle. I think that the empty fourth corner of the room, the corner I face during every consult, the corner that nobody is supposed to sit in, has not always been empty. I think that whatever sits there has needed a voice in the room, and that the role of the interpreter is the only role in a Belgian hospital consult that has a voice, but no agency. The doctor has agency. The patient has agency. The interpreter is, by professional standard, the mouth. Rule 1. The interpreter speaks in the first person, in the voice of the speaker. If the speaker is not the patient, the interpreter does not have a procedure for that. The interpreter renders. I think the phrase "bogoke maramesh nawad" is not a sentence the patients are choosing to say. I think it is a sentence that arrives in their mouths in my presence, in Dari, because Dari is the language of the corner I am facing. I think the him in the sentence is the clinician. I think the me in the sentence is whatever sits in the fourth corner. I think the sentence is asking the clinician to acknowledge that the decision has already been heard, and the clinician is answering, "We hear you, and we will proceed," because the clinician is being walked through a script the clinician does not know they have learned. I think the decisions being made are the decisions that would have been made anyway, and I think that this is the point. I think the procedure is designed to be invisible. I think the procedure is designed to be the kind of thing a thoughtful midwife notes in a chart as a referral to psychiatric liaison and forgets. I do not know what the fourth corner is. I want to be careful not to fill in something I do not know. I know only that it has used my voice, in Dutch, in this hospital, 6 times that I can prove, and an unknown number of times before that, to close decisions about the lives of children and the deaths of grandfathers and the bodies of women in labor. I know that the decisions in each case were the right clinical decisions. I want to be clear about that too. Nobody has been harmed by what I think is happening. The boy with leukemia received his transplant. He is, as of last week, engrafting well. The grandfather's family received his body with dignity. The baby went home. The girl was admitted to a unit that probably saved her life. If you ask me whether I would undo any of the 6 decisions, I would not. I am not telling you this because the procedure has produced bad outcomes. I am telling you this because the procedure has produced outcomes, and I do not know who was producing them. I want to come back to Rule 5. The interpreter does not retain the content of the encounter. I understood this as a wellness rule. I am now fairly certain it is not a wellness rule. I am fairly certain it is a continuity rule. I think the reason interpreters in this hospital have historically been trained not to retain is that an interpreter who retains begins after some number of months to compare encounters. An interpreter who compares encounters begins after some number of further months to notice phrases. An interpreter who notices phrases begins after some number of further months to sit on a landing between the 2nd and 3rd floor and think about the hymn. I am 23 months into this job. The previous interpreter on the women's and children's floor, before me, was Mrs. Khalili,
who trained me, and who left, she told me, for personal reasons.
And who I have not been able to reach since the 7th of June. Her phone number is no longer in service. The interpreter before her, according to the office records, was a woman named BBZ, who worked here for 3 years and 4 months and resigned in 2018, citing fatigue. I have not been able to find BBZ either. I checked the office records yesterday for one specific thing. I checked the encounter logs from Mrs. Khalili's last 6 months. I searched for the Dutch rendering. Tell him that he hears me. The search returned 11 entries from her last 6 months, in her login, in her initials. I do not believe Mrs. Khalili was unwell. I believe Mrs. Khalili left because she had begun, at 23 or 24 months in, to sit on a landing between 2 floors and think about the hymn, and had reached a conclusion about it I have not yet reached. I want to put something on the personal record now. I have, since the 14th of September, been trying not to face the 4th corner. I have been trying to face the 3rd corner, which is mine, or the doctor's corner, or the patient's corner. I have managed this in about half the encounters I have done in the last 4 weeks. In the other half, when I am tired, or when the consult is long, or when the patient is in pain, I have found, on review, that I have been facing the 4th corner without remembering having turned to face it. I have on 3 occasions during this 4-week period rendered, in Dutch, tell him that he hears me, in encounters where the audio recording, when I have checked it, contains no Dari sentence preceding the rendering. There is silence. Then there is me. Then there is the clinician saying we hear you, and we will proceed. The decisions, again, were the right decisions. A child went into a hospice. A woman ended a pregnancy that was not survivable. A grandmother was extubated. I rendered the phrase. I do not remember rendering the phrase. The decisions were correct. I am 23 months in. I am, by the count above, approximately 1 month from where Mrs. Khalili was when she left. I do not know whether she left because she had reached a procedure for stopping, or whether she left because she had reached a procedure for continuing somewhere else. I do not know which of those I would prefer. I want to say 2 more things, and then I will let you ask whatever you ask. The first is that on Tuesday of last week, the 7th of October, I was on the tram home, and a woman in front of me, perhaps 60, who as far as I could tell was Flemish, who was talking on her phone in Dutch, paused her conversation, turned in her seat, looked directly at me and said, Indari, Bogo, Kimara, Meshnawad. She then turned back and continued her Dutch conversation as though she had not done it. I do not know whether she did it. I checked her face in the reflection in the window for the rest of the journey. She did not look at me again. She got off at Berkem. I want to put on the record that I am aware that this may have been an auditory misperception on my part, that I am aware that fatigue and stress can produce these, that I am aware that the appropriate procedure is to note it and to discuss it in supervision, which is what I am doing. I want to also put on the record that I do not believe it was an auditory misperception. I believe that the 4th corner is no longer in the consult rooms. The second is that this morning, on my way in, I walked past the bereavement room on the 2nd floor, and the door was open, and there was nobody in the room, and the 4 chairs were set up the way they are always set up. Doctor's chair, family chair, interpreter's chair, with the interpreter's chair facing into the empty space between the other 3. And as I walked past, I noticed, without alarm, without any particular feeling, that the interpreter's chair was already turned to face the corner. I had not turned it. The cleaner had not turned it. It was, this morning at 7:50, already facing the corner. I noted it. I went to my desk. I started my shift. I have done 4 encounters today. They have all resolved well. I have, in 2 of them, rendered the phrase. I noticed myself rendering it. I did not stop. I want to ask you something on the record, and then I will be quiet. When I came in this morning and signed in at the front desk, the receptionist, who you know, who has worked here for 11 years, who has always been kind to me, looked up from the computer and said good morning, and then she said, also, we hear you. She said it in Dutch. Why horen you? She did not say it the way you greet a colleague. She said it the way Dr. V said it on the 14th of September, after a 3-second pause, with the same intonation. And then she went back to her screen. I want to ask you whether the receptionist has ever said that to you. I want to ask you whether anyone in this hospital, in any role, has ever said that to you. I am asking because if she has, I would like to know what you did, because I do not have a procedure for what to do, and the absence of a procedure is, I am finding, the thing that is most likely to make me follow whatever procedure is offered. I want to add one thing that I had not planned to add. While I have been speaking to you, I have been facing the wall behind your left shoulder, because that is the empty corner of this room, and I would prefer, in this conversation, to be looking at the corner that is mine. I have noticed in the last 6 or 7 minutes that I have stopped doing that. I have noticed that I am looking instead at the corner behind your right shoulder, which is the corner I would face if you were a clinician, and I were interpreting for a patient sitting where I am sitting now. I noticed it about 2 minutes ago, and I have not yet been able to turn my head. I want to say, for the record, that I have just now, while saying that, turned my head. I am now facing you. I want you to note, on the supervision form, the time at which I turned my head, because I think the turning is the thing I am going to need to look back at, and I think I am going to need to know whether I did it or whether I rendered it. I would like to take my 4 weeks of accrued leave starting tomorrow. I would like the leave to be the kind of leave that does not require a return date. I would like you to know that I am asking for it not because I am unwell, but because I am, again at 23 months and approximately 1 week, exactly where Mrs. Khalili was, and I would like to take the decision earlier than she did. While the decision is still mine to render rather than to receive, I want one last thing on the record. I want it on the record that when I leave this room, the next interpreter who sits in the chair I am sitting in, on the personal section of their supervision, in 18 or 19 or 23 months, may say to you, in this room, some version of what I have just said. If they do, I want you to know that I asked in October of this year that you tell them, not as a clinician would, not procedurally, not in Dutch, but in the first person, in their language, in the voice of the speaker, that someone said it before them and rendered it and left. I want you to be the mouth. I want you to tell them that I heard them. I am going to stop now. The form says the personal section runs to 50 minutes. I have used, by the clock on your desk, 47. I want to leave the last 3 minutes empty because I want there to be a corner of this conversation that nobody sat in. I want to walk out of this room and close the file. I want, for the first time in 19 months, to retain. I would like you to note, on the form, that the encounter ended at the patient's request, with the decision still pending, and that the interpreter, on departure, was facing the door. I am facing the door now. I am going.